Microeconomics. Study Session 1. General Workings of Economic Science. Introduction. Economic science is the branch of social science that deals with the production and distribution and consumption of goods and services and their management. This study session is designed to give an insight into the science of economics in relation to model building and analysis. The methods of economics. The methodology used in economics is to gather facts. Models and model building. The economic theory aims at the construction of models. These models describe the economic behavior of individual units such as 1. Consumer. 2. Firms. 3. Government agencies and their interaction create the economic system of the region. A model is a simplified representation of a real situation. It includes the main features of the real situation which it represents. A model implies abstraction from reality, which is achieved by a set of meaningful and consistent assumptions which aim at the simplification of the phenomenon or behavior pattern that the model is designed to study. There are two main purposes for model building. 1. Analytical purpose. 2. For making realistic predictions. The functions of microeconomics. During the course of business activities, firms purchase or hire economic resources supplied by households in order to produce the goods and services demanded. Households use the income received from sales of resources or services from business firms to purchase the goods and services supplied by the firms. Thus, microeconomics theory or price theory studies the flow of goods and services from business firms to households and the composition of such a flow and how the prices of goods and services in the flow are determined. An evaluation of the price system. Consumers are at liberty to buy what they want, or choose businesses to produce and sell what they choose, and resource sellers or suppliers to make their property and human resources available in whatever occupations they choose. If consumers want loaves of bread, while businesses choose to produce bicycles and businesses want resource suppliers to offer their services for the manufacture of calculators, when the consumers want some other items, then production in this instance would seem to be deadlocked because of the obvious inconsistencies of these free choices. Basically, there are 5 fundamental questions that must be answered in attempting to achieve and maintain efficiency in the use of scarce resources. These are: 1. What to be produced? 2. What organizational system to be used? 3. What to be used? 4. Who carries out the distribution of output? 5. What manner of flexibility is to be employed? Advantages of price system. The following are the function of price of a price system. 1. Allocate resources efficiently. Proponents say the invisible hand will in effect harness self-interest so as to provide society with the greatest output of wanted goods from its available resources. Maximum efficiency is attained with this system. 2. Freedom. The price system thrives upon freedom of enterprise and choice. Entrepreneurs and workers are not hunted from industry to meet the production targets established by some omnipotent government agency. Disadvantages against price system. The following are the disadvantage of the price system. 1. Demise of competition. The very element of competition may bring about cutthroat competition. Give room for business failure by dominant businesses, either by buying out other businesses or so-called inefficient businesses, by the use of any coercive method to sell out. 1. Starts out with small capital, but larger capital will be required during stiff competition. 2. Large markets are required for any form of survival. 3. Complex centralized and closely integrated management. Summary for Study Session 1. In this study session, please note the following. 1. The major highlights of what we have learned in the study session are as follows. 1. The methodology used in economics is to gather facts. 2. During the course of business activities, firms purchase or hire economic resources supplied by households in order to produce the goods and services demanded. 3. With the help of the price system, that consumers are at liberty to buy what they want, or choose businesses to produce and sell what they choose, and resource sellers or suppliers to make their property and human resources available in whatever occupations they choose. Study Session 2. Theory of Demand and Supply. Introduction. It is very important for you to note that the world is governed by demand and supply activities. Individuals in an economy make their desire known through their demand and supply of goods and services. In this study, you will be introduced to the concepts of demand and supply. Demand. Demand is the total goods and services an individual is willing to pay at a particular price at a particular time. Also addressing the demand appropriately, we assume that the products are normal goods that follow the basic law of demand, that the higher the price, the lower the number of goods demanded. Demand schedule. 1. The population size of the community. 2. The consumer incomes. 3. The taste of the consumer. 4. The price of related products. Demand curve. One thing necessary to bear in mind is that when drawing the demand curve, we use the price and quantity only and take other variables as mentioned above to be constant. In other words, we use ceteris paribus protection. This position we have taken is not unusual in other sciences. Supply theory. Supply is the total amount of goods and services an individual is willing to sell at a particular price at a given point in time. Here, the law of supply says the higher the price, the higher the quantity supply. Like the quantity of gari demanded, the quantity of gari supplied is not a fixed number. The supply depends on several things. For instance, 1. If there was bad weather through or a part of the time cassava was growing. 2. If the farm was overgrown by weed. 3. If there were many farms of cassava or very few farmers. 4. The price of gari to similar staples. Equilibrium price and quantity. There has to be the midway where the consumer and the supplier of a commodity have to agree on price and quantity. Change in the quantity demanded. Using the original schedule for demand in the above, it is obvious that a movement from A to B, B to C, is called a movement along the demand curve or a change in the quantity demanded by the consumer. Substitute and complements. When the price is high in relation to other products, and if consumers switch to these alternatives, we say these alternates are substitutes. On the other hand, if prices of some goods are high and consumers buy less of some other goods which accompany the goods in question, we maintain they are complements. Elasticity of demand. There are as many elasticities of demand as the determinant demand. The most important elasticity is the responsiveness of consumers to the change in the commodity's own price. If the change in price is very small, we use the point elasticity, but if the price change is large, we make use of the arc elasticity. Elasticity is the degree of responsiveness of demand to a little change in price. There are different categories of elasticity: price, income, and cross-elasticity. The types of price elasticity are unitary, inelastic, and elastic demand. Summary for study session 2. In this study session, please note the following. 1. Demand is the total goods and services an individual is willing to buy at a particular price at a given time. 2. Supply is the total goods and services a producer is willing to sell at a particular price at a given time. 3. Elasticity is the degree of responsiveness of demand to a little change in price. Study Session 3. Theory of Consumer Behavior. Introduction. This study session explains the theory of consumer behavior. It is important to note that the traditional theory of demand starts with the examination of the behavior of the consumer. Also, the market demand is assumed to be a summation of each individual consumer demand. The cardinal approach of utility theory. The theory maintains that utility can be measured, either in money terms or subjective units called utilities. Their theory assumes that individuals are rational, there is constant marginal utility, and diminishing marginal utility. 1. Rationality. The consumer is rational. He aims at the maximization of his utility subject to the constraint of his income. 2. Cardinal utility. The utility of each commodity is measurable. The utility is a cardinal concept. The most convenient measure is money. The utility is measured by the monetary units that the consumer is prepared to pay for another unit of the commodity. 3. Constant marginal utility of money. This assumption is necessary if the monetary unit is used as the measure of utility. 4. Diminishing marginal utility. The utility gained from successive units of a commodity diminishes. In other words, the marginal utility of a commodity diminishes as the consumer acquires larger quantities of the commodity. 5. The total utility of a basket of goods depends on the quantities of the individual commodities. Equilibrium of the consumer. We begin with a simple model of a single commodity X. The consumer can either buy X or retain his money income Y. Then the consumer is in equilibrium when the marginal utility of X is equal to its market price. This can be stated as MUX equals PX. What one has to put into consideration is that, if the marginal utility of X is greater than its price, the consumer will increase his benefits or welfare by purchasing more units X. In this case, MUX is greater than PX. Similarly, if the marginal utility of X is less than its price, the consumer can increase his total welfare or satisfaction by cutting down the quantity of X and keeping more money unspent. When MUX is less than PX, If there are several commodities, the condition for the equilibrium of the consumer is the equality of the ratio of the marginal utilities of the individual commodities to their respective prices. Critique of the cardinal approach. One of the fundamentals of utility which relies heavily on its cardinality is questionable. 1. Due to the fact that it may be difficult to measure the satisfaction one derives from commodity usage. 2. The constant utility of money cannot always be relied on, for as the income of the consumer increases, the utility of money also has a tendency to vary or change. As a result, the constancy of money cannot be taken as given. 3. Finally, the axiom of diminishing marginal utility has been established from introspection, in that it is a psychological law that must be taken for granted. The ordinal approach of utility theory. The theory states that the consumer is capable of ranking his many market baskets, and he is capable of choosing from one of these market baskets that give him the highest satisfaction. The indifference curve theory. 1. Consumer's rationality. In this case, we are saying the consumer is rational in that given his money income and the price of a market basket, he aims at maximizing his utility. 2. That utility is ordinal. You are inferring in a nutshell that the consumer is capable of ranking his many market baskets, and he is capable of choosing from one of these market baskets that give him the highest satisfaction. 3. Diminishing marginal rate of substitution. That diminishing marginal rate of substitution is the bone of contention. In this regard, preferences are ranked in terms of indifference curves which are assumed to be convex to the origin. 4. That the total utility of consumers depends on the quantity of the commodities consumed. 5. That consistency and transitivity of commodities choices are assumed. This means that a consumer is consistent in his choices. Equilibrium of the consumer. In order to define the equilibrium of the consumer using the ordinal concept, we have to introduce the concept of indifference curve, their slope, and the concept of the budget line. The above are the basic tools of the indifference curves approach. The consumer equilibrium is his choice of bundle that maximizes his utility. The slope of indifference curves is the marginal rate of substitution of either market bundle X or Y. What is an indifference curve? An indifference curve is the locus of points of particular combinations or bundles of goods that yield the same utility of the consumer so that he is indifferent as to the particular combination he consumes. Properties of the indifference curves. 1. An indifference curve has a negative slope, commodities involved. 2. The further away from the origin an indifference curve lies, the higher is the level of utility denoted bundles of goods or higher indifference curve are preferred by the rational consumers. 3. Indifference curves do not intersect, for, if they did, the point of their intersection would imply two different levels of satisfaction which will be inconsistent. Analysis. The slope of a curve at any one point is measured by the slope of the tangent at that point. The equation of a tangent is given by the total derivative or total differential, which slows the total change of function as also its determinant change. The total utility function in the case of two commodities X and Y is U equals function of X and Y. It shows the total change in utility as the quantities of both commodities change. The total change in U caused by a change in Y and X is approximately equal to the change in Y multiplied by the marginal utility of Y plus the change in X multiplied by its marginal utility of X. The budget constraint of the consumer. The consumer has a given income which sets limits to his maximizing behavior. Income acts as a constraint in his attempt to maximize utility. The income constraints, in the case of two commodities, may be written as Y equals PQX plus PYQY. You may present the income constraint graphically by the budget line whose equation is derived from expression 20 by solving for QY. QY equals L over PYY, PXQX over PY. The price consumption curve and the consumer demand curve. By definition, the price consumption curve for commodity X is the locus of points of consumer equilibrium resulting when only the price of X is varied. The consumer's demand curve for commodity Y shows the amount of X that the consumer would purchase at various prices of X ceteris paribus. Summary for Study Session 3. In this study session, please note the following. 1. The cardinal approach of utility theory. The theory maintains that utility can be measured, either in money terms or subjective units called utils. Their theory assumes that individuals are rational, there is constant marginal utility, and diminishing marginal utility. 2. The ordinal approach of utility theory. The theory states that the consumer is capable of ranking his many market baskets and he is capable of choosing from one of these market baskets that give him the highest satisfaction. In other words, he is able to rank his preference. Another name for this theory is the indifference curve. 3. Equilibrium of the consumer. In order to define the equilibrium of the consumer using the ordinal concept, we have to introduce the concept of the indifference curve, their slope, and the concept of the budget line. 4. Income consumption curve and angle curve. Leaving taste and prices of commodities the same, but varying the consumer's income, we can easily derive the income consumption curve and the angle curve. Study Session 4. Behavior of Producers. Introduction. Like the case of consumers, where we are inclined to say they seek to maximize their utility, by the same token, we can say generally also that the ultimate aim of producers is to maximize their profit from goods and services sold to society. In this study, you learn about production function and its cost. The production function. The production function refers to the physical relationship between a firm's input of resources and its output of goods and services per unit of time. Output can be increased or decreased by increasing or decreasing the input used. The output of a production process can be called returns. The function and the variables can easily be explained. Thus, Q equals function of K, L, where Q is output, T is temperature. K is capital, L is labor, M is technology. Output can be increased or decreased by increasing or decreasing the input used. The output of a production process can be called returns. Short-run production function. Input and output levels are rates of flow per unit of time. Hence the short-period production function ordinarily is subject to 3 restrictions. 1. That the period is so short that the entrepreneur is not able to change the factor which is fixed. 2. The shape of the curve is not altered by technological progress. 3. The period is sufficiently long to allow for the necessary technology process. The law of production. It describes the technical possible ways of increasing the level of production. What comes to focus when discussing this law is either the long-run or short-run analysis of production. In the case of the short run, we maintain that certain factors are constant, which is, capital, management, and in order to increase output we use the variable factor, usually labor. But if this variable input combines with the constant factor, we eventually run into the decline of the marginal production with respect to this variable factor. Now diminishing return steps in. Law of return to scale. Output can be expanded by varying all factors. This can be achieved by varying the factors by the same proportion or by different proportions. But usually, economists maintain a form of constant varying of input to achieve constant expansion of output. The term constant return to scale indicates or refers to the change in output, when all the factors change by the same proportion. Suppose we start with the initial output. XO equals function of L, K, and we increase the factors by U by the same proportion. This indicates that if X increases by the same proportion lambda, then we say it has a constant return to scale. If X increases by less than lambda, we have a decreasing return to scale. If X increases much more than U, we say we have an increasing return to scale. The marginal rate of substitution. The constant product isoquants are F into bracket KL, equals constant. Hence for any variation along an isoquant, we have FK/dK plus FL/dL equals 0. If K is substituted by L for given 0 from any given point K, L, then the marginal rate of substitution is R into bracket K, L equals dK, over KL equals FL, over FK, as represented by the absolute value of the slope of the isoquant at KL. It is assumed that R decreased as the substitution proceeds, the case of decreasing rate of substitution. The cost function. Economists define the cost of production of a particular product as the value of the foregone alternative products that resources used in its production could have been produced. In the first place, the economist makes a distinction between various types of costs. 1. The alternative costs doctrine. This entails inputs that could have been used to produce one item but ultimately now used for the manufacture of an alternative good. 2. Explicit cost. Explicit costs of production are those outlays made by a firm that we usually think of as its expenses. They consist of explicit payments for resources bought outright or hired by the firm. A. Firm's payroll. B. Payment for raw materials or semi-finished. C. Payment of overhead costs of various kinds. D. Payments into sinking funds and depreciation accounts are examples of explicit costs. 3. Implicit cost. Implicit costs of production are those costs of self-owned, self-employed resources that are frequently overlooked in computing the expenses of the firm. Unit cost curve. Though the TC curve is important, the unit cost curves are very important for the reason we will adduce as we progress. The unit cost curves are AFC, AVC, TAC, MC. The long-run LAC and LMC. The LAC is derived by a combination of the short-run SACs from several scales of production in different firms in the industry. Summary for Study Session 4. In this study session, you have learned that 1. The production function. The production made by any firm is made possible by the explicit cost incurred by the firm. The costs are the amount spent on the inputs used by the firm to produce output. The ability of the firm to produce output that will maximize profit will depend on how best the firm can combine the inputs, for example labor and capital. 2. The cost function. Economists define the cost of production of a particular product as the value of the foregone alternative products that resources used in its production could have been produced. On the other hand, costs of resources to a firm are their values in their best alternative uses. This is called the alternative cost doctrine or the opportunity cost doctrine. Study Session 5. Market Structure. Introduction. In this study session, you will understand why microeconomics is concerned with examining the economic behavior of both buyers and sellers in particular markets. This study introduces and examines the idea of market structure such as perfect market competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. Market structure. Market structure is best defined as the structural/organizational and other characteristics of a market. Market structure is the number of firms producing identical goods, which are homogeneous in nature. Types of market structures. The types of market structures include the following. 1. Perfect competitive market. Perfect competition means there are few, if any, barriers to entry for new companies, and prices are determined by supply and demand. Assumptions of a perfectly competitive market. 1. Many suppliers, each with an insignificant share of the market. This means that each firm is too small relative to the overall market to affect price via a change in its own supply. Each individual firm is assumed to be a price taker. 2. An identical output produced by each firm. In other words, the market supplies homogeneous or standardized products that are perfect substitutes for each other. Consumers perceive the products to be identical. 3. Consumers have perfect information about the prices all sellers in the market charge, so if some firms decide to charge a price higher than the ruling market price, there will be a large substitution effect away from this firm. 2. Imperfect competitive market. The imperfectly competitive structure is quite identical to the realistic market conditions where some monopolistic competitors, monopolists, oligopolists, oligosoponists, and monopsonists operate. Concept of total, average, marginal revenues, and demand revenue in a perfect competitive business. 1. Total revenue. The total revenue of a firm is the total amount of money that the firm receives by selling a certain quantity of output. This can be illustrated as thus: TR equals PXQ, where P equals price, Q equals quantity, TR equals total revenue. Example: calculate the total revenue for a firm that is selling 10 television sets at 21,000 naira each. TR equals P times Q equals 21,000 naira x 100 equals 2,100,000 naira. 2. Average revenue. Revenue earned by a firm per unit of output is called average revenue. Average revenue is equal to price in both competitive and non-competitive markets. This can be illustrated as thus: R equals DR over Q, where R equals average revenue, TR equals total revenue. Theory A 136 Q equals units sold. 3. Marginal revenue. Revenue earned by selling an additional unit of output is called marginal revenue. In other words, a change in the revenue resulting from a 1-unit increase in output is marginal revenue. Demand curve facing a single firm. The equilibrium price is determined by the interaction of market demand and market supply. Since the output of each firm is a small share of this total output, no individual firm can affect the market price. Thus, each firm faces a demand curve for its product that is perfectly elastic at the market price. How firms actually act requires understanding the competitive environment in which they operate. Perfect competition exists in an industry where 1. Many firms sell identical products to many buyers. 2. There are no restrictions to entry into the industry. 3. Established firms have no advantages over new ones. 4. Sellers and buyers are well informed about prices. Profit maximization. Marginal cost is the additional cost from one additional unit. A firm maximizes its profits by producing the level of output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Marginal revenue equals the market price for a firm facing a perfectly elastic demand curve. Break-even price. If the market price is just equal to the minimum point on the ATC curve, the firm will receive a level of economic profits equal to zero. In this case, the owners of the firm are receiving a rate of return on all of their resources that is just equal to that which they could receive in any alternative employment. When this occurs, there is neither an incentive to enter or leave this market. Short-run supply curve. We have already observed that a perfectly competitive firm will produce at the point at which P equals MC, as long as P is greater than AVC. The graph below indicates that at prices of PO, P1, P2, and P3, this firm would produce output levels of QO, Q1, Q2, and Q3, respectively. A bit of reflection should convince you that the MC curve can be used to determine the quantity of output that this firm will supply whenever P is greater than AVC. Long-run equilibrium. In the long run, firms will enter the market if positive economic profits are received and will leave the market if economic losses are realized. As market supply increases, the equilibrium price falls. This process will continue until firms no longer have an incentive to enter the market. Assuming a typical firm is receiving an economic loss, such firm will leave the industry in the long-run equilibrium and economic efficiency. This long-run equilibrium condition has two desirable efficiency properties. P equals MC and P equals minimum ATC. The equality between P and MC is important for society because the price reflects society's marginal benefit from the consumption of the good while the marginal cost reflects the social marginal cost of producing the good. Consumer and producer surplus. As noted in the section on demand and utility, consumer surplus is equal to the net benefit that consumers receive from the consumption of a good. It occurs because the marginal benefit from each unit of the good exceeds the marginal cost up to the point until the last unit is consumed. Producer surplus is defined in a similar manner as the net benefit received by producers from the sale of a good. It occurs because P equals MC only for the last unit produced. Up to that point, the marginal cost of producing the good is below the price received by the firm. In the graph below, the shaded region equals the amount of consumer surplus, while the lower shaded region represents producer surplus. The net benefit to society, also known as the gains from trade, equals the sum of these two areas. Summary for Study Session 5. In this study session, please note the following. 1. Market structure. Market structure is best defined as the structural, organizational and other characteristics of a market. Market structure is the number of firms producing identical goods, which are homogeneous in nature. The major yardsticks by which one can distinguish between different market structures is the number and size of producers and consumers in the market, types of goods and services being traded, and the degree to which information can flow freely. We focus on those characteristics, which affect the nature of competition and pricing. 2. Profit maximization. To maximize profit, we need to get the concept of the revenue and the costs of the business. Profit is maximized when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, i.e. marginal revenue equals marginal cost and marginal cost is rising. Marginal revenue is the additional revenue from one additional unit. Study Session 6. Distribution Theory. Introduction. In this study, you will learn differences that exist between product market and factor market. Here, you will learn basic concepts of factor pricing, which would be useful as foundation for the understanding of the theory of distribution. Concept of theory distribution. The theory of distribution is an attempt to explain how income is distributed among the factors of production. To produce goods and services, firms need the services of factors of production, such as land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. The prices paid for these factors of production are called rent, wage, interest, and profit. The factor pricing is therefore concerned with the determination of prices of services of these factors of production. Definition of theory distribution. According to Anatole Murad, the theory of factor pricing deals with the prices paid for factor services and earned by the sellers of a factor of production, that is the households. The theory of factor pricing is the same as the theory of distribution. The factors needed in the production process are also known as production services, resources, or inputs. The explanation of factor pricing helps us in two ways. 1. It completes the analysis of the function of prices and the mechanism of resource allocation. 2. It allows the understanding of the forces undermining the distribution of total income among various groups of factors owners. Reason for the study of factor pricing. You study factor pricing for the following reasons. 1. To understand how the forces of demand and supply determine prices of the factor of production in the factor market. 2. To understand the different roles participants play in the market, as firms are sellers in the products market but buyers in the factor market. The differences between factor market and product market. Factors of production are never demanded their own sake, thus the demand here is a derived demand. The employer of factors of production only uses these factors in the production of goods and services to be finally sold in the product market. The demand for goods and services is direct demand, as goods demanded directly satisfy the need of consumers, for example, the demand for apples by a consumer. Nature of supply in relation to price. There is a definite relationship between the price of goods and the supply of goods in the product market. There is a linear relationship between the supply of goods increased in response to the rise in the price and decreases in response to the fall in the price. Nature of supply in relation to cost. The supply of goods is dependent on the cost of producing such goods and services. However, it is not that the same in the factor market. It is almost impossible to estimate the cost of supplying factors of production. Basic concept of factor pricing. The basic concept of factor pricing involves the following. Productivity of the factor. A clear understanding of basic concepts in factor pricing will help you appreciate the operations of the market participants both in a perfectly competitive market and imperfect market. These concepts relate to the following. 1. Productivity of the factor. Productivity of factor is the amount of a commodity produced per unit of resources used, while production refers to the total amount of a commodity produced. Therefore, the contribution of a factor of production to the total output has two types: marginal productivity, and average productivity. 1. Marginal productivity. This refers to an extra unit of output or product as a result of the employment of an extra unit of labor while keeping the application of other factors fixed. Subheading. Marginal productivity can be used in these three ways. 1. Marginal physical productivity. 2. Marginal revenue productivity. 3. Value of marginal physical productivity. Average productivity. Average productivity refers to the per unit productivity of a variable factor. The concept of average productivity may be used in the following two aspects. 1. Average physical productivity. 2. Average revenue productivity. 3. Relationship between ARP and MRP curves. The average productivity divisions were also learned by you, such as 1. Average physical productivity TPP divided by N. 2. Average revenue productivity ARP equals Apex price. 3. Finally, you learned about the relationship between ARP and MRP curves. Summary for study session 6. In this study session, please note the following. 1. Concept of theory distribution. The theory of distribution is an attempt to explain how income is distributed among the factors of production. To produce goods and services, firms need the services of factors of production, such as land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. 2. Basic concept of factor pricing. The basic concept of factor pricing involves the following. 1. Productivity of the factor. 2. Cost of the factor.